He does not tell you what is happening in his head. That is the whole problem. And that is why you are here. When you go silent, when you stop texting first, stop reacting to his stories, stop being the soft, available presence he got used to, something shifts inside him that he will probably never admit to your face. Most people assume silence is a weak move, a sulky retreat, something that only hurts the person doing it. But psychologically, silence is one of the loudest things you can do to another human being, especially one who built a quiet, comfortable routine around your attention. In this video, we are going to walk through what actually happens inside his mind day by day when you disappear from the conversation. Not the version he would say out loud to his friends, not the confident shrug, not the I'm fine text, but the real uncomfortable psychological process underneath it. We are going to talk about the first cracks of confusion, the ego bruise he will not admit to anyone, the private bargaining he does with himself at 1 a.m., and the moment, and there is always a moment, where his brain stops being able to ignore your absence. If you have ever wondered whether your silence is actually doing anything, whether he even notices, whether he is secretly relieved or secretly unraveling, stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand exactly what is happening on the other side of that unanswered message. And somewhere around the 1 minute mark, something is going to happen inside his head that most people never see coming. Day one is almost always a non-event to him, at least on the surface. He notices you have not texted, maybe he even notices around the exact time you usually would have, but his brain files it under busy or tired or later. This is not because he does not care. It is because human beings are wired to assume the pattern will continue. Psychologists call this a kind of expectancy bias. We predict the future based on the recent past, and the recent past has trained him to expect you eventually respond. So on day one, there is no panic. There might be a flicker, a half second, where his thumb hovers over his phone, wondering if he should check in, but he talks himself out of it. He tells himself you are probably just occupied, and he goes back to his day feeling, if anything, mildly pleased with himself for not being needy. This is the part nobody expects. Day one often feels like relief to him, or at least neutral ground, because his ego has not yet been threatened. He is still operating on autopilot, still assuming he holds the same place in your life he held yesterday. But here is the part that changes everything, the part that happens faster than most people think. And it usually starts sometime between hour 12 and hour 20 of silence. Not day two, not day three, but somewhere in that strange in-between window, most people scroll right past. That is when his brain does something it was not planning to do at all. It checks, not once. It checks your last seen, your story views. Whether you posted, whether you are online, whether you are typing somewhere else, and just not to him. He will tell himself it is casual, that he is just scrolling, that it means nothing. But underneath that casual scroll is a nervous system quietly recalibrating, trying to answer one question it did not know it needed answered. Are you still there, or are you actually gone? This is the cliffhanger moment, the shift you need to remember, because everything that comes after, the confusion, the ego bruise, the bargaining, grows out of this one small, almost invisible act of checking. He will not tell anyone he did it. He might not even fully admit it to himself. But it happened, and it changes the entire shape of what comes next. By day two, the neutral feeling from day one starts to curdle into something closer to irritation. This is where his internal narrative usually goes one of two ways. And which way it goes says a lot about how he actually values you, even if he would never phrase it like that. Some men slide into a defensive story almost immediately. She's being dramatic. I didn't even do anything. If she wants space, fine, I'll give her space. This story is comforting because it protects his ego. It puts the responsibility on you, frames your silence as an overreaction, and lets him avoid looking at his own behavior. But underneath that defensive story, there is almost always a quieter, less comfortable thought trying to surface. A small, nagging, wait, Did I actually mess up? He will suppress that thought quickly because sitting with the possibility that he caused this is uncomfortable. And most people, not just men, will choose a comfortable lie over an uncomfortable truth in the first 48 hours of any conflict. This is not a character flaw unique to him. It is a basic psychological defense mechanism called cognitive dissonance reduction. When two thoughts conflict, I'm a good partner and she is upset with me, the brain will often distort the second thought to protect the first. So on day two, expect him to look calm, maybe even a little smug, while privately doing quiet mental gymnastics to avoid admitting fault. Day three is usually where the tone starts to change in a way that is harder for him to hide, even from himself. This is the point where the absence stops being background noise and starts becoming a presence of its own. Silence, psychologically, is strange because it is not nothing. It is an active signal that the brain has to keep processing over and over, precisely because there is no new information to replace it. Every time he checks his phone and there is nothing from you, his brain re-registers the absence as if it were new. This is called a Zeigarnik effect in psychology. Our minds fixate more on unfinished, unresolved situations than on ones that have closure. An argument that ended with a slam door and radio silence sits in the brain very differently than one that ended with a clean, mutual conversation. Your silence has created an open loop in his head, and open loops are exhausting to carry. By day three, he is thinking about you more than he was when you were actually talking to him every day, which is the cruel irony almost nobody explains. The version of you that goes quiet often occupies more mental space than the version of you that was constantly present. This is also usually the point where the small, private checking behavior from day one evolves into something more deliberate. He is not just glancing at his phone anymore. He is constructing theories. He is replaying the last conversation you had, searching for the exact sentence where things went wrong, rehearsing what he would say if you texted right now, and quietly rehearsing what he would say if you never texted again. Both of these internal rehearsals are happening at the same time, which is part of why this period feels so unsettled for him. His mind is holding two completely different futures simultaneously and cannot yet tell which one is real. Uncertainty, psychologically, is far more distressing to the human brain than a confirmed bad outcome. Studies on anticipatory anxiety consistently show that not knowing an outcome activates more sustained stress responses than knowing a negative one. This is why day three often produces more restlessness in him than an actual breakup conversation would, because at least a breakup gives the brain something concrete to grieve. Silence gives it nothing but a question mark, and question marks are exhausting to live inside. By day four, something interesting starts to happen with his sense of identity, particularly if he is used to being the one who is chased, reassured, or prioritized. If your attention has, even subtly, become part of how he measures his own value. And for many people, especially those with a fragile sense of self-worth wrapped up in being wanted, it has, then your silence does not just feel like losing you. It feels like a small erosion of his own sense of importance. This is the part almost nobody talks about because it sounds almost too vulnerable to admit. His ego is not just bruised because he misses you specifically. It is bruised because your silence forces him to confront the possibility that he is replaceable, that the world keeps turning without his input, that he does not hold as much power in this dynamic as he assumed. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a threat to the relational self, the part of our identity that exists only in relation to how others see and respond to us. When that mirror goes dark, some people spiral into genuine self-reflection and others spiral into anger because anger is easier to feel than helplessness. Watch for this on day four. Irritability that seems to come from nowhere, a slightly harsher tone if you do finally respond, a need to appear unbothered that is almost too performative to be believed. Day five tends to be where the bargaining phase kicks in, and this is one of the most human most universally relatable parts of the entire process, whether we are talking about romantic silence, a friendship gone cold, or even grief after a loss. Bargaining is the mind's attempt to regain control over a situation that feels increasingly out of its hands. He might start drafting messages he never sends. He might type out 3 sentences, delete them, retype them softer, delete those too. He is trying to find the exact combination of words that will get a response without looking like he cares too much. Because vulnerability, to a lot of people, feels more dangerous than losing the relationship itself. This is the paradox that keeps so many silences dragging on longer than they need to. Both people often want the same resolution, but are equally afraid of being the one who reaches first and gets nothing back. On day 5, if he has not reached out yet, it is rarely because he does not want to. It is because his fear of rejection has, for the moment, outweighed his fear of losing you completely. Those two fears are constantly trading places in his head, and which one wins on any given hour depends on his mood, his pride, and how the day has gone. Somewhere around this point, usually between day 5 and day 7, a strange kind of nostalgia starts creeping in, and this is worth sitting with because it is one of the most psychologically loaded parts of the whole process. He starts remembering, not the arguments, not the reasons things got tense, but the good moments, filtered and softened by time and distance the way memory almost always does. This is called rosy retrospection, a well documented cognitive bias where our brains selectively favor pleasant memories over unpleasant ones as time passes, especially when we are anxious about losing access to those memories altogether. Your silence, ironically, is doing something you may not have intended. It is editing his memory of you into something better than the version he was actually living with. The version of you he is now missing is not entirely the real you. It is a slightly idealized, slightly softened version, shaped by absence the same way a song sounds better once you have not heard it in a while. This is part of why silence can be so much more powerful than any argument, explanation, or plea ever could be. Arguments give the brain something to defend against. Silence gives it nothing to fight, only space to remember. By the end of the first week, if the silence has held, something shifts again. And this is the part that surprises people the most. The anxious, checking, bargaining energy of the early days starts to give way to something quieter and in some ways more concerning: acceptance, or at least the beginning of it. Not acceptance that he was wrong, not necessarily acceptance that he needs to change, but acceptance that the silence might actually continue, that you might not be coming back to fill the space you used to fill. This is the point where his brain starts doing something psychologists call anticipatory loss processing, essentially rehearsing grief before the loss is even confirmed as a kind of emotional insurance policy against being blindsided. You will not necessarily see this from the outside. He might seem more distant, more distracted, even more short tempered around other people because he is quietly doing the emotional labor of preparing for an outcome he has not been told is certain. This is also, paradoxically, the stage where some people finally send the message you have been waiting for, because the fear of a confirmed loss becomes worse than the fear of vulnerability. And it is also the stage where other people go the opposite direction and start emotionally withdrawing on purpose, deciding it is safer to beat you to the ending than to wait and see if you will beat them to it. What is happening underneath all of this, across every single one of these days, is something worth naming directly because it explains almost everything else. Silence removes the thing his brain was using to regulate itself. If you were a source of comfort, validation, entertainment, or emotional stability, even in small, everyday ways like a good morning text or a shared joke, then your sudden absence is not just an emotional event, it is a kind of mild withdrawal, similar in shape, though obviously not in scale, to the way the brain responds when it loses access to any consistent source of reward. This is not romantic exaggeration, it is basic neuroscience. Consistent positive interactions with another person activate reward pathways in the brain, and the sudden interruption of that pattern can produce genuine restlessness, preoccupation, and craving, the same basic mechanism that shows up in far more serious contexts, just at a much gentler intensity here. This is part of why silence so often works better than pleading, arguing, or over explaining ever could. It is not manipulation in the cartoonish sense people imagine. It is simply removing a variable his brain had come to depend on and letting his own nervous system do the rest of the work. It is also worth talking honestly about the version of this that does not have a neat, satisfying arc, because not every story ends with him realizing everything and showing up with the right words. Some people, when faced with silence, do not spiral into reflection at all. They spiral into avoidance. They fill the space you used to occupy with distraction, more time with friends, more scrolling, more casual conversations with other people that give them a small hit of the same validation without any of the risk. This is not necessarily because they do not care. It is often because sitting with discomfort is a skill, and not everyone has built it. Avoidance is the psychological equivalent of covering your ears during an uncomfortable conversation. It does not make the conversation disappear. It just delays the moment you have to actually hear it. If you are someone waiting for a sign that your silence has worked, it is important to understand that some people will take much longer than a week to stop avoiding, and some, frankly, will keep avoiding until the option to come back has quietly closed on its own. There is also a version of this that deserves honesty rather than comfort. Sometimes the silence reveals not longing, but relief. If the relationship, whatever form it took, had become a source of pressure, conflict, or obligation for him, your absence might genuinely feel like exhaling after holding his breath for a long time. This is not a pleasant thing to consider, but psychological honesty matters more than a satisfying story. And the truth is that silence is a mirror. It reflects back whatever was actually there. If what was there was mostly comfort and habit rather than genuine emotional investment, the silence will not produce longing, bargaining, or nostalgia at all. It will simply produce quiet, undramatic distance, and eventually indifference. The only way to know which version of this story you are actually living is time, because both storylines look identical from the outside for the first few days. Both start with no response. What separates them is what happens by day 10, day 14, day 21. Whether the silence eventually breaks with genuine effort, or whether it simply becomes the new normal, unremarked and unrepaired. If we assume this is the version where he is genuinely affected, and statistically, in situations where real emotional investment existed, this is more common than people expect. Then, somewhere around the second week, something shifts one more time, and this is arguably the most psychologically significant moment in the entire process. This is the point where the story he has been telling himself, the defensive one from day 2, the one where you were overreacting and he did nothing wrong, starts to lose its structural integrity. It is hard to maintain a self-protective narrative for 2 straight weeks without new information reinforcing it. Every day that passes without contradiction from you, without a text proving him right or wrong, forces him to sit alone with his own thoughts for longer than his ego is comfortable with. And thoughts left alone for long enough tend to get more honest, whether we want them to or not. This is when a lot of people finally have the uncomfortable realization they were avoiding on day 2. Not necessarily a dramatic epiphany, but a quiet, private admission, usually made alone, usually never spoken aloud to anyone, that maybe actually he did play a part in this. What makes this whole process so quietly powerful and so different from confrontation is that nobody argued him into this realization. Nobody explained, justified, or pleaded him into seeing your side. Silence let him arrive there on his own, through the much more convincing, much more permanent process of sitting with himself. Insight that people reach on their own tends to stick in a way that insight handed to them in an argument rarely does. This is a well-established pattern in behavioral psychology, sometimes summarized as the difference between persuasion and self-persuasion. When someone else tells you that you are wrong, your instinct is often to defend yourself. When you conclude it privately, with no audience and nothing to prove, there is no ego left to protect because no one was watching. That is the quiet power underneath every day of this process we have just walked through. It was never really about punishing him with silence. It was about giving his own mind the space to do what could never do while you were still there talking, explaining, and filling every uncomfortable pause with reassurance. So here's what I want you to sit with as this video comes to a close. Everything we just walked through, the checking, the defensiveness, the bargaining, the nostalgia, the withdrawal, the eventual reckoning, none of it happens the same way for everyone. And none of it happens on a guaranteed timeline. Some people move through these stages in days, some take months, and some honestly never make it all the way through at all. But understanding the psychology behind it changes something important. It takes away the powerlessness of wondering whether your silence is doing anything at all and replaces it with the quieter, steadier understanding that absence is never neutral. It is always doing something, even when nothing visible is happening on your side of the screen. Whether what it eventually produces is genuine growth, honest reflection, and someone showing up better than before, or whether it simply confirms that the investment was never equal to begin with. Either way, you deserve to know the truth of which one it is, rather than living inside the uncertainty forever. Now, I want to hear from you, because this is where your story matters more than mine. Have you ever gone silent on someone and actually watched them come back different, more honest, more aware, more willing to show up the way you needed? Or did the silence end up teaching you something harder, something about walking away for good instead? Tell me in the comments which version of this story you lived through, because I promise you, someone reading your comment right now needs to hear that they are not the only one who has sat in that same uncertain, aching silence, wondering what is happening on the other side.